Okay, hey everybody, welcome back.
Hey.
We're glad you're still around. We haven't recorded in a while.
Like we talked about last time. Yeah.
That's right, we're back.
If you just listen to our episode back to back, then you would not know that 7 months have transpired.
Yeah, that's true. You know, and really, what are 7 months compared to eternity, right? So I mean,
we don't talk about that yet.
That's true.
So
that was a teaser.
Full disclosure. This is the second attempt at this episode. We recorded last week. It went great. And then we found out it didn't go great because the sound was off.
Yeah. I take
so
we're gonna
try to recreate word for word everything that happened and was said there.
That's right. It's gonna be amazing.
So far, we're off to a bad start.
Yeah,
because I know we didn't say any of this.
We're probably like less than 1% overlap so far.
Yeah.
Cool. So
a lot has changed in the world since the last time.
That's true.
Coronavirus. Murder hornets, earthquakes.
I don't remember what murder
hornets. Race riots. Oh, that's right. But I did mention that in our first attempt. I mentioned murder hornets.
You did talk about what murder hornets were, and I can't remember how. I still can't remember.
I don't know. It was flash in the pan.
Really bad hornets, like Africanized bees or something?
I don't know. I'm sorry I even brought it up because I should have known that you'd want to know all the scientific
I'm sure
details.
There's some kind of analogy in there for human relationships, but
I'm sure there is.
We'll have to explore it another time.
Yeah. Viviana. Oh, okay. We have our friend Viviana here as well. Say hello.
Hi.
And she taught us about the what are these called? Avocados. You were watching a lot of documentaries. There's the word. Wow. Yeah, one of which was about avocados and the black market. I don't know, for the Mexican
controversy.
The Mexican black market for avocados.
The involvement of the Mexican cartel.
The narcs,
I think, right?
The
narcs
are in it.
And the avocados. And anyways, and Viviana's also an expert woman. Like the other women that got the podcast.
I'm the token woman for today.
So, anyways, and we have kind of an announcement.
Oh, yeah. So, you may... Okay. Well, essentially, because we thought, we'd kind of start changing the direction of the podcast a little bit, and we're coming out of the closet as Latter-day Saints, which most of you probably already knew, because most people listen to this are people we know from our personal lives. We do have some downloaders in strange places all over the world.
Yeah, Kenya, Uganda, some parts of Australia.
Yeah, and they probably didn't know this, but maybe they guessed when we were like quoting Gordon B. Hinckley and stuff. Maybe some people picked up on it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Sure, by Latter-day Saints, that's shorthand for we're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That's right. And essentially, we're going to incorporate that into our discussions as well. So we're still the same podcast. We still talk about social science and cultural trends and just everyday experience. But we'll also we've just broadened that scope a little bit to include a spiritual element as well. And we don't want to be too sectarian about it. Certainly, we want to incorporate good knowledge and insights wherever they can be found. We just happen to come at this from the perspective of Latter-day Saints. So, hope that's not a deal breaker for anyone. We still intend to be very social sciencey and very open-minded, but that's where we're coming from.
Certainly.
We're because the whole idea of the podcast is talking about human relationships, not just dating, but just human relationships and relationship with God. We feel is an important part of that as well. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're good. We seek truth. We don't claim that our church has a monopoly on truth, but
right.
But it certainly, and it doesn't. Truth comes from a lot of different places, but it certainly casts. I don't know what's the right word for it, but it kind of enhances the way we see some things.
Yeah.
You know? So
Yeah.
So we just want to talk openly about that.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the noises that Bryce is always making fun of me for making noises.
He makes strange noises all the time.
Well, so when I'm so oftentimes when I'm like reading news on my phone, I'll be reading something. I'll be like, and Bryce always laughs at that.
Yeah, it's more like,
Yeah, it's like, It's that means I learned something or something.
Yeah, or when he takes a swig of something that apparently is very refreshing, he'll go like a 5-year-old.
Yeah, like when a 5-year-old drinks Kool-Aid.
Which honestly, I do the same thing too. But it's just very distinctive with Paul, and he makes lots of other, I think, unconscious noises.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, so why don't we just jump right in here? I guess, right?
Well, why don't we introduce
that's right.
or reintroduce ourselves? Since we're kind of starting fresh here, kind of like we're starting fresh. So I'm Bryce. I do this podcast, as you know. I did my undergraduate education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and graduated right before the Great Recession, so it was terrible. And I ended up doing a master's program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I did it in public policy. So I'm very social sciencey. That's kind of my thing. Especially I like psychology and economics. You already know a lot about my interests. Professionally, I've worked for the federal government. I've worked for tech briefly. I was self-employed for a while. I've worked in the legal field a little bit, although I'm not a lawyer, like some people. Currently, I work for a nonprofit, and I also trade stocks. That's me.
Awesome. And I'm Paul, and I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks of Phoenix, and kind of the hood.
Explains a lot.
A little bit. We were pretty poor growing up. But I ended up going into engineering, and then so I did undergrad in engineering, then switched gears a little bit and went to law school. So I do patent law. So I'm in private practice as an attorney, patent and trademark law. It's sometimes pretty interesting. Some days are boring. Some days are awesome. Depends, on the day.
He has strong opinions about perpetual motion machines.
That's right. I don't believe in them.
Strong but fact-based.
I don't believe in them in our universe anyways. I don't deny that perhaps in another universe with different laws of physics, perhaps they're possible. But anyways, that's basically it. During all that education, I became an expert in human relationships. That's I'm joking.
You have a scientific curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would say also, your training prepares you to analyze and think critically about complicated matters.
Sure. Yeah, I consider myself a critical thinker.
Yeah, me too. I'm critical of your critical thinking. And my analysis tells me it's good.
Okay, good. Because I was gonna...
Let's face it, not everyone is a good critical thinker. Most people are not.
Yeah, that's right.
I think most college people, if they took the ACT or the SAT, they'd bomb the critical reasoning part.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Yeah. I interrupted you again. What were we going to say?
I like to say I'm discerning, It's like, why am I not friends with some people? Because I'm discerning about my friendships. That's kind of a mean way to put it. I don't know.
But it's honest.
It is honest. It's true. For sure, man. Okay, so Viviana, we gotta have you introduce yourself.
So where am I from? I am from Texas, and specifically I'm from a border town. And that is actually where I did school. I went to the University of Texas at El Paso, and I did an undergraduate in English education. And then I taught Spanish education for about 9 years. And at this point in my life, I am considering going back to school, specifically to be a marriage family counselor. And things that I'm interested in, I'm pretty much like Bryce and like my partner here, Paul, interested.
Paul. Did I deserve that?
The co-host here on I definitely am interested in human relationships and human dynamics and maybe complex things. So that is maybe why they brought me here, because they wanted me to...
That is why we brought you here. You're absolutely right.
They wanted me to be a token Latina woman.
Not token, integral.
Oh, thanks. So, yeah, what expertise do I bring to the podcast? I love watching this series on Netflix and Hulu Plus called Married at First Sight.
Oh, this is something we talked about.
Yeah.
Good.
And I love watching I love exploring how different relationships function, but also how I love exploring how self-fulfilling or how, core beliefs influence self-fulfilling prophecies in certain ways.
Viviana, you're overthinking it. You're overthinking it. That's what underthinkers say.
Yeah.
Their eyes start to glaze over at this point.
Yeah. And it's just really interesting because watching this series, you can see how there's so many ways that a marriage could go right, but you could also see how there's so many ways that a marriage could go wrong.
Wait,
really and truly.
What is this called?
Married at First Sight.
It's on Netflix?
It's on Netflix, season 9, and
Season 9?
Seasons
Holy moly.
like 4 to 8 or 4 to 9 are on Hulu Plus.
Oh,
Hulu, yeah.
Interesting.
And
so what's the premise, though?
The idea is it's a social experiment, and they are matched up by... So there's like 200 or 300 single adults, and what they do is they kind of weed through them, and...
Not single adults in the LDS church sense.
Right, yeah.
For those who are Latter-day Saints listening.
But what they do is they kind of, they have them go through a series of psychological evaluations, and...
A lot of them fail and never make it on the show.
Yeah, but they only end up picking 3 couples, so that's 6 people, or sometimes they pick 4 couples, and they have home visits, and they're chosen by a psychologist, a marriage family therapist who's also a pastor, and then also a woman who's I guess she has a PhD in sociology from I think it's one of the
weaker social sciences.
Yeah. Hey. But they kind of try to look at the partners and see if they can match them up, and what's really unique about this series is you can kind of see the different challenges that people have, and you get to learn so much about dating without actually dating.
Wait, okay, because they're paired. They get married.
They get married, and they're
committed to marry these people before they've met them.
Yes,
crazy.
And they marry each other at the altar.
They meet each other at the altar.
They meet each other at the altar.
Holy moly! Yeah. Okay, but they've had interactions beforehand.
No.
None? These are arranged marriages.
They're arranged marriages.
Whoa.
So it's a social experiment. The only thing they know about each other is what the other partner's ring size is.
What?
That is how crazy it is. So they basically have to trust the sociologist and the psychologist.
Ring size is the mirror, the window to the soul.
There you go.
That's the first time I heard that.
They definitely have to heavily trust the people who are choosing the partners, and they have to trust their judgment. And
okay, but the
I wouldn't
choosers,
trust most of my great friends.
The choosers, are they trying to pair people up well, or they're like, hey, we're going to randomize this experiment?
No, they don't randomize it. They try to pair people up according to compatibility and according to values.
Interesting.
Sure, but like I heard somebody say, when you're like, I wouldn't even trust my best friends or family to do that kind of thing, and like I heard somebody say one time that when people set you up, you get to see what they really think about you.
Yeah, that's right.
By who they set you up with.
Yeah, like, and it's usually different from how you see yourself.
Right.
Are you serious?
What?
Like, okay.
Do you really know me?
But then it's also really hard because, when people set you up, it's hard. I feel like most of the times people set you up, one of you just isn't attracted to the other one, and
that's usually my experience.
And it's hard. I've had good setups too, though. I've had relationships from setups. And, one of my brothers got married from setup. But,
wow.
Yeah, so
it does happen.
But I mean, that's the way marriage was done a long time ago, anyways.
Right.
Yeah,
everyone was set up,
and their expectations were way lower.
Yeah, that was
for better or for worse.
That was before we invented love.
That's true. They didn't marry for love back then. You're right.
I think it was the Romantic movement in America and in Britain that kind of spurred this
When was
whole
that? Was
idea
that the
on.
1800s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Also,
Because I think back then I don't know, things were a little bit different.
Yeah, it might be like a progression, you know, because like
Probably.
even I remember reading this book that was a book about literature that came out of world wars. I wouldn't normally have read this, but
Says Bryce.
okay, I lived with a bunch of guys that had like we had a huge bookcase in our front room. These guys were just such voracious readers, you know. Evan.
They were racist readers?
No, voracious readers.
Voracious.
Don't give their names. They're gonna get killed.
Nobody said anything about racism. Get out of here.
Everything's about racism, Paul.
Okay, stop. Anyways, and so I was like, we had this gigantic bookcase that was so full of books, and I was like, you guys, I'm gonna read every book from beginning to end. Like, so I started at the top left, and like this, and they were all laughing at me. You know, I really only made it like 3 or 4 books through, but this was like one of the books. It was just because where it was placed in the top left corner, so I read it, and but it was interesting how like even in that book, like the stories that were like about World War II. I feel like I remember accounts where people were talking about their marriages. Women were talking about their marriages. They just seemed not as focused on like being romantically in love. Yeah. More like seemed to be a good guy, and you know, it was good times.
A respectable man.
There we go.
That's Mr. Darcy.
Yeah.
That's
the
yes. And that's what I am, a respectable man.
You're in the wrong time period. That's not enough now.
Good sir. And that's
good sir.
Whenever I get mad at Bryce, I like shake my lapels and I'm like, good sir. Good day to you, sir. That kind of thing. Anyway, sorry.
I was listening to a lady by the name of Ether Perel. She's a marriage family therapist, and I think she's also a psychotherapist. And she talks about how marriage has significantly changed in America.
Yeah.
And she talks about how initially it was a production economy. Like, oh, we're going to get married and we're going to have lots of children and they're going to work the farm.
Yeah.
And then it went from that to maybe in like the 70s or 80s to like a service economy. But she also says that nowadays what, marriages have become is they've become this what they call an identity economy, where it's like, I want you to fulfill every need. I want you to be my therapist, my lover, my confidant, my my mother, my father, just like everything, know.
Right.
Everything that a community. So she says what it used to be what you could get from a community, we now want from our spouses.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but, what percentage of people actually find that, do you think?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't think it's high. Sorry, go on, Paul.
I was just thinking it would be interesting to try to trick kids as they're growing up into this idea that like actually when you get to a certain age you go out and you work but you contribute all your money back to the family, similar to like the working on the farm kind of thing. I don't think it would work in today's society, but it would be interesting because because back in the days people had more kids because kids were less of now they're a financial liability, right? They were a financial asset back then. But hey, if we had them go work at Burger King and contribute money back to the family, they're a financial asset for a while.
Yeah, then people would have more kids. It's the ticket to riches.
Yeah, I think so.
Now they're all just expense.
And then we'll all get rich. It will all work out between the rich and the poor.
Well, also part of that comes from, the child labor laws that were enacted after the Industrial Revolution.
That is very true.
Right?
You can't just hire kids to do whatever you want anymore without any restrictions.
But you can in third world countries.
Like the good old days.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But anyways. Yeah, no, those are interesting thoughts. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think like mostly it's a good thing that we can. I think mostly it's a good thing that we marry for love in Western culture generally, but I don't know.
I don't know either.
To it either.
There's definitely pros and cons.
And
but from our perspective, right? We couldn't fathom not marrying for things other than romantic love.
Yeah, you'd have to like,
or else we'd be married right now, which none of us are.
Well, sure. I feel like almost everybody who's not married probably has somebody who would be willing to marry them if they were willing to settle, or whatever. Sounds bad, but
marry someone who merely had good qualities,
So why do you think that people choose not to marry, even if they're like, okay, well, this person is a respectable person, right? Why would a person choose not to marry another person? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we prefer to be single than being married to a person we don't love. You know, and I think that's okay.
Or that we find boring, right?
Perhaps.
That doesn't meet our identity needs, what we as we see them, right?
Yeah, sure.
But do you think you could learn to love someone? You know, and that's like the very Eastern thought,
Yeah.
right?
Well, so yeah, that's tricky because okay, I actually so I'm gonna throw in some gospel stuff.
I'm going to allow that because now we're okay with that.
Bryce used to really laugh when I can't remember if it was when he first moved in here, and I kept listening to this Ben Harper song where he keeps saying that's the power of the gospel. But
Great, now we're gonna have to pay royalties.
oh,
I don't know.
Thanks, Ben. Okay. What was I saying?
I don't know. I keep interrupting you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I know what I was saying, and I've talked about this in some of the relationships that I've been in. Like, from an eternal perspective, I believe, and in our religion, we believe in eternal marriage. So it's not just like marriage till death do you part. It's marriage for forever. After this life, it never ends. And
we believe that requires like authority. Like,
that's right.
You can't. It doesn't just happen, right? Anyway, this is not a Sunday school lesson.
Sure, absolutely. And it involves you both progressing and becoming better people and stuff all along the way. But like, I believe that my personal belief is that all marriages that stay intact for eternity become like the perfect marriage.
Yeah,
I believe that about all human relationships. You know, I lost my dad a few years back. I mean, this was like 2013, and I've talked about this some on here, but like I felt like sometimes like I didn't as naturally connect with him as some of my other brothers who just were kind of more similar personalities to him. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of hard for me when he passed away. You know, I felt like I had some guilt about that. But I feel like he's still involved in my life. I believe that all relationships that are eternal, that stay intact, can become perfect over time.
Yeah. And
so I believe that about marriage too. But
sure.
In general, what I believe though is that in this life, in mortality, we're kind of choosing the things that we don't think we can wait for eternity for.
Right.
Like, so I think all of us kind of decide that like, I can't wait for physical attraction. That's men and women. They can't wait for that. And what are the other things that are so important to you that you can't wait for them? You know, I do think that in some, you know, little microcosms that we have, we start to get super picky about stuff, you know.
Absolutely.
Like, well, you're not going to live in Arizona. Well, all right, forget it, you know. Which maybe, you know, I think some things we start to get kind of fickle, but yeah. Anyways, those are my 2 or 3 cents.
Some people get so consumed with, you know, just everything about the other person. They're like, well, you need to have a certain type of job. You need to have a certain type of look. You have to, you know, and some people tend to be a little too perfectionistic to the degree that I don't think it's healthy, and it doesn't help them in any way, because they could overlook some really great, you know, personalities.
Sure.
But just because they have these prerequisites, they've kind of you know, because they have certain expectations of what love is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
They kind of dig their own grave, so to speak, or prison. They create their own prison through which they look at life.
Yeah, and thank you, because that just reminded me of some things I said last time.
Excellent.
Because I think, you know, in the Latter-day Saint world, there's definitely some like cultural blind spots or cultural superstitions that get in the way. You know, and I remember we talked about this on our first run with this. You know, I'm a big believer in agency, and from the Latter-day Saint perspective, we think that. You know, we believe it was such a controversial issue that there was a war in heaven over it, and that a lot of God's children didn't have the opportunity to come to earth because they weren't on board with it. You know, and when we talk about agency, we talk about choice as well as accountability. And, you know, I think agency is still very controversial now. I think the human tendency is to want unlimited choice and no accountability, right? Wait, how does this relate to what you were saying?
Being over.
Oh, right. And so I think there's a tendency to underestimate how much is actually expected of us, and I think a lot of that can be like learned helplessness, where we just don't feel that we have any power to do anything about stuff. So we just say, oh, well, it's external forces, primarily. I think a lot of it's that. Certainly there are lots of things which are not in our power, but I think we tend to underestimate what things are in our power to do anything about. And that's really like God's purpose for us, is to learn to use our agency and to grow and to become stronger, to become agents to act, not be acted upon. Doctrine and Covenants, section 58 says they're agents. We're in the power. The power is in them, wherein they're agents unto themselves. So I think to some degree our expectations are just like, these are things that are out of my power. I've pinpointed these are issues in my relationships, and I feel that I'm powerless to do anything about them. Therefore, I need to be selective about these, and I think there's a balance to be struck. I mean, because I could tell you what they are for me in my relational expectations and why I have those there. And it's not just to fulfill my identity needs. It's like, hey, I've recognized these are challenges for me in a relationship, and so I think these are things I actually need in a relationship. Anyway.
It's hard in settings where you've got like a million choices too, and I mean, I think that's kind of like, that might feel like what it's like.
I wouldn't say a million choices. I'd say the perception of... the vague perception of possibilities.
Yeah, well, I think it's true. Like, it's the perception that there's always other people out there to meet, and especially if you like online stuff. I haven't really done like online dating, but like,
I have.
Well, I have a little bit, but in the times that I have, it's kind of like, well, yeah, there's always someone else, and now we're in the location that we're at. There's like a lot of people to meet too, but anyways, I know they've done studies on this. The paradox of choice talks about this, but if you had like a group of like 10 people and like that was it, and you knew that was it, you would pick faster, because it would be easier for you to say like, well, this is the best option, and if they'll go for me, then okay, and if not, then you go down the list. But and then you end up being happier about your choice than people who have a gigantic list to pick from, and then they end up picking someone, and then they still have a hard time
the opportunity
wondering,
cost.
Did I really make the best choice?
The opportunity cost is not unbounded like it is when you feel that the ocean is humongous, and there's great people out there that would just fall head over heels over you if you just met them. Right?
You know what? I actually had a dating experience where that happened. The guy was like, well, if we were in an area where there was not a lot of LDS people, I would continue going on dates with you.
You're like, I hate that you said that, but that was honest.
But since we're in an area where there's lots of people, and he's like, you're kind of attractive, Vivian, so you're gonna be just fine.
Oh, okay.
That's what he said to me. He's like, so I'm not gonna keep on going on dates with you.
I see. What was your response?
I was like, okay.
Patronizing much?
Yeah.
But
I will not air my response, but I will just say that is true. That is a true thing that happens all the time.
Yeah.
At least most people tend to say think things like that, but he just happened to say it.
Yeah, that's very, very brave. I've found that there's a lot of things I just should not say in that kind of context, and that would have been one of them. I
had at least one or two.
Euphemisms are very useful in that kind of situation.
When you get to this age, I think you've had a lot of relationships, generally, and
we're all mid-singles age, by the way. We're all over 30.
Yeah, and I remember at least one of the girls that I dated saying, and she had backed out of the relationship, and I remember years later running into her, and she was like, "I can't believe you're not married." And I remember thinking, you
didn't help.
You of all people should believe it. You didn't want to go forward.
Was she married at that point?
She had been married and divorced, I believe.
Oh.
Yeah. Had a child.
You could have said something snarky then.
I suppose I
You probably shouldn't have.
You could have said you had your chance.
Yeah.
I didn't.
You had your agency.
I did have a second chance, actually,
right.
too, but I didn't want to date her then.
Yeah.
But, yeah, anyways, interesting stuff, you know. I think kind of like, Bryce, like what you were talking about, like, things being more in our control than we sometimes think, you know. And to me, that's like Nephi and the boat kind of thing, you know. It's in our scriptures, the Book of Mormon, that there's a story about a guy who's given instructions to build a boat, right? But he's not given the boat.
So they can sail to the promised land.
Yeah, and he's just told how to make the boat and then where to find the tools. And he asks, like, okay, where do I go find ore? And he starts making tools.
Yeah.
But he builds the boat himself. And it's and there's another Bednar talk. I can't remember what it was, but
he's a leader in our church.
Yeah, David Bednar. And he said something like, what God gives us generally is like raw materials and opportunity.
Yep.
And we have to take advantage of it, you know.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes been guilty of this. I think of, especially when I'm like pulling out of a relationship, thinking like, well, there's something else out there and God's going to provide. And
I'll just sit on the sofa here.
yeah, not necessarily that, but more like, but I do think to some extent and maybe some of it is this fantasy of like the perfect relationship, you know, and sometimes I think like the more people we date, the more in our mind we have kind of like this hybrid person who takes on
the best qualities of everyone that didn't work with.
And they've dated none of their bad qualities, and you know.
But I think that's idealization.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, well, you know, like Paradox of Choice talks about like satisficers versus optimizers, or whatever. Yeah. And that optimizers, I feel like I'm an optimizer. Yeah, you're trying to optimize, you know, and so you're trying to like, well, it's important for me to have a happy marriage, but you know, if I look at the clock, you know, it's like, well, it's also important just to have one too. Yeah. But you know, is it? I don't know. It's, anyways. There's a lot that goes into that, but yeah.
It's like Bryce said. It's a balance of managing our expectations, but also managing our agency. Or like, but we've all been talking about that. It's a very difficult line to straddle.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, anyways, we were talking about how, I don't know, we talked last time about how like marriage rates are like declining and stuff.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because believe it or not,
bad?
Our main conversation topic was a little more broad, and we just kind of jumped into something else. But yeah, the question is, what's it like to be a single Latter-day Saint in 2020? And I think one of the main like trends we see there is just that like marriage is on the decline. It has been for a while, in our society, in American society, as well as in the church. And my question is that good, bad, or some mixture of both?
Yeah, here's a question for you guys. Kind of like related to that, like in the Nixon administration, I don't remember if we talked about this. In the Nixon administration, they tested out a like a supplemental income kind of thing, kind of like basic
you did mention
this. Yeah, okay, and they stopped it partly because they realized that the test group that they did this among had a higher divorce rate, and anyways, let's listen to a podcast that was talking about this, and on the podcast they kind of like said unqualifiedly like, well, that was a good thing because that meant people were getting out of bad marriages, you know. But I think there's pros and cons there.
It's funny they just jumped to that conclusion.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like because you know, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, that like even if you're in a pretty rocky marriage, like maybe the husband and wife will be happier to end the marriage, but it definitely has long lasting effects on the children. It's definitely worse for the children. Yeah. Usually. Yeah. For the divorce to happen, even if it's a pretty rocky marriage. Right. And like I think sometimes society doesn't really take that into account.
Well, we don't want to, because
it's uncomfortable, because it's the truth.
Well, maybe they don't see it as truth, but it's an uncomfortable possibility that I'm in this crappy marriage, but staying in it is going to probably, all else being equal, is going to be good for my kids. That's very unpalatable. And we're not saying that it's wrong to get out of that relationship, but it's complicated. Like you're saying, there's other consequences as well.
Yeah.
Likely.
Yeah. And there's like, obviously the church believes that there's certain circumstances in which
For sure.
divorce is warranted.
For sure.
Yeah. Totally.
But it is very interesting. Like, after watching that series on Married at First Sight, it is very interesting to see how different couples, because of their personalities and because of their expectations, they have different conflicts.
Yeah.
And expectations, and how that changes that changes the style of every different relationship. And it's also really interesting to see. I was listening to this, or actually I read this book called How to Avoid Marrying a Jerk. And it talks about how just the importance of really getting to know the person that you're marrying. But also they talk about how so much of marriage is just the willingness to forgive and kind of like practicing charity to some degree, and overlooking. I also read somewhere in one of the, I don't know if it was a BYU speech or a general conference address or maybe a fireside, but one of the leaders of the church said something about how marriage is really about having your eyes open to all of your flaws, but your eyes half open to your partner's flaws.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting why people have conflict and how to, how they navigate through the conflict, because that's really at the core of most of the divorces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
President Hinckley used to talk about that a lot, that, selfishness is at the root of a lot of divorce.
Right.
There was I don't remember who it was, like a 70 or something. That's another leader in our church. They're called 70s. And he was speaking at our state conference or something one time. And he said that he had some meeting with President Hinckley. And when he went there, President Hinckley was actually like working on some shed that they were building out in the back of their house or something, out in the back of their yard. And there was this like closet, and President Hinckley wanted to use it for something. I can't remember what for. And his wife Marjorie wanted to use it for like to put vacuum and some other stuff in there, so it'd be easier to clean the place. And so they were kind of like arguing a little bit about that. I mean, it didn't sound like it was very contentious, but they were kind of going back and forth about it. And one of their daughters was there, and she told the 70, said, "You watch, Mom wins every time." and so they kind of kept talking about it, and then President was like, "Well, all right, okay, I guess we'll go ahead and put the vacuum and stuff in there." And it struck me as an example of, considering the other person and not being selfish.
Yeah, and it's a form of sacrifice, right? He's making a compromise, and
sure.
And probably in the relationship he's found, there's other things that like he recognizes she compromises about as well, and
sure.
he wants to, so it's a dynamic system. Relationships are, and I think that's why this is one of the very most important things that our church teaches is you got to marry the right person, in the right place, right authority. This is it's a hugely important, and I think it's not, the reason is not because of all the emotional fulfillment you'll get from marriage, which you will compared to being single. On average, obviously there's great marriages and there's not great marriages. But it's really, this is how God works with his children. He wants them to grow and to become like him. And part of learning to grow and become like him is to have an eternal marriage, a like consecrated, godlike marriage where you learn to work with someone, to overcome difficult things, to sacrifice, to forgive. Those are like the essence of what our church teaches. And it's difficult, so.
Yeah, for sure. Like, right, Joseph Smith has the statement, "I'm a rough stone rolling," right? And I only get smooth as somebody chips a corner off me or something. Yeah. And so I kind of feel like mortality generally is like we're all a bunch of rough stones kind of put in a tumbler and we're all kind of tumbling together. And then a family is like a few rough stones put in a blender. It's like a
right.
It's like there's a lot of potential polishing there.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like, and that's one of the things I feel like I'm missing out on with why not being married is the growth and the opportunity to sacrifice and to be more selfless. I mean, as a single, I'm kind of inherently my default state is a little bit more selfish probably because
Yeah.
I don't have
and it's a lot easier. It's less fulfilling, but it's easier.
Yeah, we talked
but the way forward is not clear, right? Because you don't just. I don't think the solution is just to just commit to anyone, right?
Absolutely not. And I think
and say, hey, give me all the hardship you can. I need to make this as hard as I can. No one wants that, right? Nor should we. But the other extreme is a temptation as well, which is, I need the other person to be absolutely perfect in every way. Because that's what I want my marriage to be. And of course we want that. And of course it's not wrong to want that. But I think to expect that causes problems. And I think that prolongs the singleness. And, half the U.S. is single. And I think in the church population, I don't know the stats, but I'm guessing we're headed in that direction as well. There's just tons of single people in the church.
Yeah. Well, so to kind of get back to that question, like the decline of marriage generally, there's maybe some good in it too, in that there aren't as many bad marriages, right? But there's bad too.
Yeah.
And it's also true that it's not necessarily just that. So of course we get more children growing up in single homes too,
which statistically are bad for kids, almost being equal.
Absolutely.
And single parenting births out of wedlock have gone up a lot.
Yeah,
which, as a public policy guy, that's a big concern for me. If for no other reason than the strain on social safety nets, but obviously there's the human suffering element as well, of not having a father or whatever, which has a big impact. Go ahead.
I was listening to this lady's TED Talk, and she's a divorce attorney, and she represents men. And she talks about how
I think I saw this one. She's like from Las Vegas.
I don't remember.
And she talks about the story about her dad
putting
we don't want to talk about it.
Easter egg, anyways, she talks about how 70% of homeless kids don't have a father.
Yeah.
And that is really astounding and crazy. Yeah. And it's sad.
Yeah, the numbers have gone up. I was looking at some of this stuff, and so there's all kinds of different studies, and they'll even split this up like by race, because it's different by race too, about the number of kids that grow up out of or that are born out of wedlock, and there was definitely a rise. Like every single race has been going up since like the 1940s or something, and when it was kind of low for most groups, but like in the 60s, there was like kind of everybody all the graphs kind of like pitched up a little bit, and they seem to be kind of like tapering off now, but they're still pretty high. Yeah. So, and that's not good. I mean, my
but there's not the kind of thing people riot over. It requires too much statistical knowledge. It's not emotional enough.
Yeah, it's true. There's this Far Side cartoon where the kid had like his baseball had gotten thrown through a window, a broken window. And anyways, his dad was like lecturing him, and he actually was like drawing physics and math on the board about how the baseball had actually gone through the window and stuff, and it said something like Bobby learns to hate his dad's lectures, Although like my dad like was very gentle about discipline, and he would just talk to us, he would like take us on a drive and talk to us, and that's all he would do. And I remember my brother Tommy got in real trouble one time, and he was over at his friend's house, and the friend's dad gave his friend like a little whooping, and then he told Tommy, he's like, "Well, Tommy, I can do you too. I can let you go home to your dad." Tommy thought for like 1 second. He was like, "I think I'll go home to my dad." So you might prefer a lecture to like getting whooped on or whatever.
Corporal punishment, which by the way, I read an article that talked about how kids who are spanked have less gray matter in their brain. Whoa, have you heard about that?
No,
doesn't surprise me.
Yeah,
but what was it saying?
It was just saying that exactly, that it changes the neurology of your brain, plasticity, something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But there's a documentary on Netflix, and it talks about babies, and it actually, so they did this research. And the hypothesis was, well, does a baby's parenting neurology, is it affected by parenting styles? And what they did is they scanned all these babies at the beginning of, of their birth. And 6 months later, they came back and they observed the mother, the way in which the mother helped the baby, access the toys and, play with the toys around him or her. And for every time that the parent did not support did not help the baby, they kind of documented it a certain way. And for every time that the parent actually helped the baby, access the toys, they documented that. And they also documented the amount of interactions that the parent had with the child as well. And so what they wanted to see was well, does that affect the plasticity of the brain? And what they found was that there are changes in the brain because of the way that the parent parented, which is crazy and controversial. But
yeah,
you can't say that.
Well, no, you were talking with Viviana one time. You were talking about some other show you were watching called The 9 Months That Made You, right?
Oh,
and it was
yes.
talking about all kinds of different effects, long-lasting effects on children, just from what your parents are going through, just from what your mom's going through while she's carrying you before you're even born,
Yeah.
which I think is really interesting.
And even what your mom eats.
Yeah.
Yeah, it affects the longevity of your life.
And we talked about on this podcast before too. Like I remember there was a Freakonomics.
I hope hamburgers and pizza were what, because that's what no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you sound like that Deep Thought.
Dude,
Like,
yeah,
if God lives within us, I sure hope he likes enchiladas because that's what he's got. We talked one time before on this, but like I had heard some Freakonomics podcast that was really interesting about how children there's a big difference in minority children don't have as many words spoken to them during the first so many years of their life or months, whatever. I can't remember what it was, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I can't remember what all the reasons were that they gave. I'm sure some of it was related to income and being a single parent and stuff like that. But and those kids that don't get as many words spoken to them, like they're always behind the other kids.
Yeah.
They're just always behind,
Yeah.
and so. Anyways, and I don't know. I felt like it spoke to that to me spoke to the importance of mothers because mothers speak more to children and they speak more generally. They speak more words. Yeah. And their children benefit from that. Yep. So, anyways.
Okay. Well, too. For the last 15 minutes or so, let's go back to the original question. Sure. Marriage is not... Or even the more original question than that one, which is, what is it like to be a single Latter-day Saint in 2020? I think it's a great time to be single. It's also a terrible time to be single. It's a jungle out there.
The best of times and the worst of times.
It's a jungle out there.
Yeah.
It's not hopeless. Definitely not hopeless. But I think it's a great challenge existentially to know, how do I live my life in such a way that this doesn't have to be permanent? Or I think more importantly is what is God's purpose for allowing me to go through this? And I'm hoping your answer isn't, well, he just wants me to wait for something good to happen. And I know no one consciously thinks that, but I think the way we behave sometimes is that, right? That it's a little too passive. We don't give ourselves enough credit for our ability to improve things, and our responsibility to do so as well. So I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of potential. I think a lot of the personal growth I've gone through in the past several years, been absolutely necessary, and a lot of it has had to do with how I approach relationships and how I approach my life, really. In the LDS Church, we talk about faith being a principle of power and of action. And it's something where we become co-creators with God, and it's not, and the relationship is another, I think, false idea in church cultures that we think that that God just wants to dictate things to us, right? That thou shalt do this and that, and he does do that for sure. There are certain things that, but I find for the most part, it's not things you definitely should do and things you definitely shouldn't do. It's like you figuring it out with his input and sometimes his approval, but really you're becoming a co-creator, right? Like you're making the decisions, which, you know, instinctively none of us want to make decisions if we're going to be held accountable for the outcomes, right? Yeah. But we don't have to shy away from that. We just, you know, the important thing is you learn how to make good decisions so that you don't need to worry so much about the outcomes. That's really, anyway, I'm rambling, but.
Yeah, I think if we're trying to optimize, you know, and if we think to ourselves like, well, I've got access to Revelation, and hey, God, like, you know,
just tell me what to do.
You know better than me.
I'm just gonna sit here. You just tell me when.
Yeah.
And what?
Exactly. It's not really like the best model. I was gonna say earlier, I'm really glad that, you know, when Viviana was reading that book, How to Not Marry a Jerk, that I'm glad it wasn't. It
talks specifically about you, Paul.
It was just a pamphlet.
Just kidding.
No, it doesn't.
Just kidding.
It's just a pamphlet.
He's a respectable man.
Yeah, that's right. It talked about me.
That's what I claim, anyways. It really was just a 2-page pamphlet. It just had pictures of me and Bryson there. It just said, just don't date these guys.
Stay away from these guys. Yeah.
Like, sorry.
Yep.
No, but
apparently that pamphlet was widely read.
Yes.
Because it's working.
Yeah, man. I mean, I've got like, you know, obviously, I think a lot of singles in the church now would prefer to be
in the church and outside of the church.
In the church and outside the church. Singles, I think a lot of singles would prefer to be married than not. Now, and you talked a little bit. We had in some of the notes here. We talked about how, in general, though the ages at which people feel comfortable marrying gets older and older.
Yeah.
People feel more like it's kind of like the capstone of their,
right.
you know, their education and getting a career and
right.
stuff like that. And then I think there's pros and cons to that, you know. I mean, because I think like in our church culture, we were kind of taught generally, we have been for a long time, to kind of just get married when you're younger and stuff. And I think in the long term, I think there's a lot of good effects that come out of that. Although I also had heard that like we have a lot more bankruptcies and stuff, you know, because people aren't that smart with their money. They get married young, maybe, but then maybe they also don't sacrifice perhaps, or I don't know, maybe they don't.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see that
They're
as
not
related.
paying their tithing.
I don't necessarily see that as related, like
to getting married young.
I think just Americans in general aren't great with managing their money, or a sizable proportion of them, and I think a lot of that is because we're never taught it in formal education, and presumably not in home environments either.
Sure. Yeah.
Are you talking about within the church where there's bankruptcies, or are you talking about just within the United
church,
States?
Especially within the church. Like,
really, I wasn't aware of that.
But I don't have like a citation to back this up, which I like to have. So you have to take this with a grain of salt. But I had read that like Provo had like just really a high rate of bankruptcies compared to like other places, you know.
Yeah.
Because it's keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah. Well, this is another thing that I said last time, and that I just remembered that I said, which is, another of these like cultural, superstitions is, or not superstitions. I would call this a bad habit. A cultural bad habit is because in our church we talk a lot about like principles, right? Which is important. That's what we teach, principles. But sorry, I just got distracted.
We're number 8. We're number 8 for bankruptcies.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Our fact checker.
Is this Utah?
State of Utah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's. I don't know.
Okay, you mull over that, and I'll finish what I was saying, which is what was I saying?
I don't know.
Oh, just that like it's easy to talk in generalities, right? To talk in vague generalities, but I think those aren't useful for application. And this is why, like in church, like teacher's manuals, for instance, like some of the prompts for like questions you can ask as the teacher, are things like, how has this principle affected you? To try to get people to talk about specifics. I think humans generally, it takes more mental work to talk about specifics, and generally we avoid things that are, harder. But So when you talk about, more bankruptcies, to me, in my mind, I interpret that as like, well, it's these people who took a good principle, like, don't be too picky about marriage, or, don't delay it for the wrong ideas. And maybe they didn't look into the specifics enough. Like, hey, how am I going to keep this family financially solvent? And especially if you were like Bryce and you studied a not marketable major like psychology.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, also I think too,
and then graduated right before the recession.
Yeah, some of this ties back in my mind. Some of this ties back into like what you were talking about before about like, how much we expect God to like kind of save us,
Sure.
From our moral issues or just hardships. Like, well, yeah, God. So getting married at a young age and not having a lot of money, okay, but you still have to be like smart with your money and careful and stuff, and not expect that like, well, God's going to save me from bankruptcy because we're doing the right thing.
Right.
Well, no, if you're not smart with your money, you might not, and maybe that's a good lesson for you to learn.
Yeah.
Can I also say something? Well, something that I'm not from Utah.
Me neither. None of us are.
But one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes maybe for some people, not all people, there's a little bit of that keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah,
and so
sure.
that could be a contributing factor to people getting into bankruptcy because they feel they have to fulfill a certain image or something, whatever.
So that to me is kind of similar to like, well, not exactly the same, but like when you were talking about like Sunday school lessons being general, I feel like,
well, the principles are general.
The principles are general,
We
right?
try to dig into the details.
It's true, but we don't tend to like talk about our own issues at church. Like we don't talk about our own issues on Facebook.
Except for some people, they talk too much about them.
Yeah, that's true. We do have some offenders in every group of people, but to some extent, I feel like sometimes the gospel teachings aren't felt as deeply when you're talking so generally, and
exactly
not talking about like, well, I'm actually legitimate right now. This is something I'm going through, and kind of put yourself out there, kind of thing. It doesn't happen a lot in some church settings, and like I said, similarly on Facebook. That's why like you look on there, and it's like everybody has an amazing life, they're doing great, and they're not really, but
How much time do you spend on Facebook these days, Paul?
Well, I don't spend any on that.
I feel like people are being way too real, way too transparent about their inner angst these days.
Okay. That's fair.
It does depend on the person, but I'd guess the average has gone up.
Yeah, that's fair.
With all the unrest in the world today.
We're in kind of in a weird moment. In general, I guess. In the past, Facebook's been kind of like that. Social media.
Which, by the way, I've learned that Instagram is actually used to meet people, and apparently it's less toxic and angsty than Facebook. So I'm going to try to start using Instagram, where people are still pretending that their lives are fantastic in every way, instead of Facebook, where they're providing ample evidence that their lives are not.
It's because you can put those filters, and so once you have those filters, then it's all
That's
okay.
right. Just filter away any blemishes. Yeah.
Happy filter. That's awesome.
No, I was also going to say something that I think might be causing the bankruptcies maybe in Utah is because Utah also tends to be, the small business capital of the world.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a lot
there's a lot of entrepreneurs.
I'm sure there's a lot of,
and so that
there's several factors.
That might be also another contributing factor, but I don't know.
Yeah. And I also think when we talk about these like studies, you have to remember, well, I mean, obviously for us, we're interested in like how representative is this of like LDS culture, but you have to remember, like, Utah, the population is not monolithic, right? Like, so I don't know. I'd be curious to know, like, stats about the population they actually studied.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know. It's all, I haven't really looked into it, so I can't really speak to it. But yeah, it's true. You got more entrepreneurial stuff going on here, and you expect more bankruptcies probably when you have that. Right. It's not necessarily a bad thing, I was reading something about the United States before we had bankruptcy law, and George Washington like had some friend who was like a hero of the Revolutionary War kind of thing, or he'd like been like a general underneath him or something, and he was in debtor's prison because he couldn't pay off some debt. And anyways, I can't remember. It was like something like that was like one of the one of the things that made him think that maybe we should have some way for people to absolve their debts. You know?
Yeah.
Anyways,
So we've gone in an interesting direction.
Not necessarily related to
I
marriage.
mean, I love talking about financial stuff, so I'd love to
Yeah.
get more into that.
Sure.
Because I think debt is interesting. And I would say this. This
definitely one of
this
those
is my
things
final
that's
thing. I do think that young people today are very comfortable with debt in a way that previous generations probably were not, right? And so much of that is driven by consumption of higher education that is just the costs have skyrocketed and people will pay apparently any amount for education. And so, and I think that factors into just how young people live their lives financially, which is recklessly, and I'm not immune to this. I have a lot of debt, a lot of that, most of that has come from like business stuff, but I think this is kind of a parallel for how we approach, other aspects of our lives as well. It's like, I want the good stuff now, and I want the hardship and the paying for stuff later, if not never. Right? And that's kind of what we're doing with our single status too, right? It's like, well, I'm going to enjoy life now and have a difficult but maybe rewarding marriage later or never. I don't know. I need to flesh out that analogy, but
Yeah. Okay, so for me, what is it like to be a single Latter-day Saint in 2020? I would also...
in -1 minute.
Okay. I would also say, there's definitely challenges, but we are living in some pretty amazing times.
Sure.
Unprecedented, and obviously coronavirus maybe presents new challenges. However, I feel like there's still lots of opportunities, and I think, if anything, I'm hoping that this coronavirus will allow people to wake up and see that they don't want to be alone for the rest of their lives.
Which some social scientists have posited that that this is going to change how people approach it, where they're less
picky.
Less picky. Yeah, where like.
So
it's increased things like domestic violence, though, and spousal abuse, I believe, in the short term, because. I think financial stresses in general are bad for a marriage. Like they're tough on it,
Yeah.
And a lot of people are going through financial stress right now. But anyways, cut you off
because of the bankruptcies.
Because of the bankruptcies, yes.
I would just say that I don't know. I think everything in life has its challenges, and it is difficult, I think, sometimes. And the older that you get, I think the harder it is for you to continue to stay single, because I don't think man was not meant to be alone, know?
Yes.
And
I have a lot of anecdotal evidence.
Yeah. So it's challenging, but we are living in some of the best of times. I truly believe that. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, it's been a good episode.
Yep, we're done talking.
Well, thank you for your patiently waiting for 7 months for the subject.
And boy, I hope the sound worked this time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it did.
Okay. And, thanks for tuning in, everyone.
See you next time. Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcasting app and give us a rating. Thank you.